Hello everyone, welcome back to this final part of lecture 4 on analyzing performance and financial statements. And in this part I want to talk a little bit about the capitalization of R&D expenses. So as with operating leases, reality is kind of catching up to the practice of capitalizing R&D expenses, but a little less so than for operating leases, because in IFRS you can indeed put R&D expenses down as capital expense, but in US GAAP, so the generally agreed upon accounting practices, you cannot do that yet. Maybe you can somewhere in the future. As of right now, you cannot yet. So why is R&D seen as this operating expense in the US GAAP? Well, that's because in principle this is, well, an operating expense, right? It looks like an operating expense. So you're paying researchers in an office, you're paying for equipment in the lab, you're depreciating the equipment in the lab. So all in all, yeah, you could say that is simply just personnel expenses and simply just depreciation. So this should be treated as an operating expense. However, if you think about R&D is really not an operating expense in that, well, you make operating expenses to immediately generate revenue. But that's not the case for R&D expenses because, well, with R&D, you're trying to build like a type of research asset that you want to use for a longer period of time. And so, for instance, something like a patent, you're not just going to use that for 1 year. You want to use that patent for 10 or 20 or however long the patent goes, years. So that means that R&D expenses in that sense are way more like capital expenses, like building property, plant and equipment that you are using for multiple years, than it is as an operating expense that you're just using to generate revenue immediately. So as such, you can say, hey, why we should treat R&D as a capital expense. And this makes especially a lot of sense when you're trying to compare multiple firms that have differing levels of R&D expenditure, right? So if you want to compare a company that has a lot of R&D expenses with a company that has very few R&D expenses, then maybe you want to capitalize that R&D expense to get a better sense of, hey, what is the actual financial performance of this firm? So what do you do to capitalize these R&D expenses? Well, first of all, you need to kind of, for yourself, argue why certain R&D expenses have certain impact. So you want to specify an amortizable life for the R&D expenses. So you want to know, suppose you're trying to research a patent. Then you want to know, should I depreciate that patent over 5 years, over 10 years, over 20 years? And very common is to use something like 5 years or 10 years. Then once you have defined this amortizable life for the R&D asset, then you want to sum up all the expenses that you've put in to the R&D asset. How much have you actually put into the R&D? How much have you actually put into R&D? And how does that translate into the value of a certain R&D asset? And then you want to amortize that over the lifetime of the R&D asset. So I understand that this is a bit vague, so let's get into a specific example. So here for Tesla, I looked at the 2019 annual report, and Tesla in its annual report, so I don't think the 2020 annual report is out yet, maybe just about, but should still be a little while longer. So 2019 annual report, they reported their R&D expenses, also older annual reports, also R&D expenses. So latest R&D expense was about 1.3 billion. And then going back, well, you see all these R&D expenses. And then I here assumed an amortizable life of 5 years. So what does that mean? That means that, well, the expenses that I have in 2019 contribute for 100% to the research asset. In 2018, still contribute for 80% to the research asset. So I'm going to say, hey, of this knowledge that I poured money into last year, 80% is still very usable. But as we go back further and further and further to, let's say, 2014 or 2013, well, all the knowledge that I gained here has been completely, is now completely obsolete because it's so long ago. So this kind of gives you a sense of, hey, how how quickly does this knowledge antiquate, right? So if you have a company for which knowledge, well, that you gained, let's say 10 years ago, is still very important, yeah, 10-year amortizable life makes more sense. If you're doing something like, let's say, software development or so, then maybe even a lifespan of 2 years or 3 years would be way better. So it kind of depends. It depends on how you can defend what is going on here. But suppose we have this amortizable life of 5 years. My question to you is, what is then the value of the research asset in 2019? And here I get a value of 3,815 million, so 3.8 billion. So how does that work? Well, I'm going to say, hey, these R&D expenses have a lifetime of 5 years. So that means that my R&D expense that I did in 2019 contributes for 100% to the research asset. 2018 for 18%, 2017 for 60%, etc., etc. And then the value, I simply sum all of these values up. And then the value of my research asset is about 3.8 billion. All right, so that means that I can now adjust my debt with this, or adjust my invested capital with this research asset, right? So I've invested more money into into my research assets, so that means that my invested capital is now higher. My assets will also increase with exactly this amount. So long-term debt I have here as, so long-term debt is right here. And then equity is right here, and then adding the research assets investments right here gives me a certain invested capital. So now let's adjust operating income. Operating income, what we can do is, first of all, we can re-add the expense in R&D because it's not an operating expense, should be treated as a capital expense. But of course, we also need to subtract the amortization of the R&D. So if for the first year, so for 2019, I see that this contributes for 100% to the research asset. This contributes for 80% to the research asset. So that means that 20% of this 1460 is amortized. In 2017, the expenses from 2017 contribute for 60% to the research asset. So that means that, well, last year it was 80%. This year it's 60%, so that means that over this year 20% of this R&D expense is amortized. Same here, right? So for 2016 in 2019 contributes to 40%. Last year was for 60%, so that means that this year 20% of this 834 is amortized. So what is the total amount of R&D expense that is amortized for Tesla in 2019? And there the value is 971. So why is that? Well, if you look for 2019, nothing is amortized, so it doesn't matter. For 2018, well, back in 2018, this 1460 contributed 400% to the research asset. Now it contributes only 80%, so that means that 20% here of this 1460 is amortized. Same for the 2017. Last year it contributed for 80% to the research asset. This year it only contributes for 60%, so 20% is amortized. And 2016 as well, 2015 and 2014. And then of course for 2013 and 2012 doesn't matter anymore. So for each year, simply look at what is the amount of R&D expense that is actually amortized over that year, and then that gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on with the changes. So if we then look at the operational income before taxes in 2019, this was, let's see, a loss of 69. What is the operational income for Tesla after capitalizing R&D expenses? And here I get a value of 303, right? So we re-add to this 69, we re-add R&D expenses of 1343, and we subtract the amortization, so the 971. And then we get a value of 303. So rather than getting a loss, we now have profit. So this is likely a way better representation of exactly what is the return for Tesla. So you get a better sense of, hey, what's the return on invested capital for Tesla. So that's how you capitalize R&D. So R&D, first of all, adjust the make adjustments so that you calculate the value of the research asset. For the operations, re-add the R&D expenses because they're not operating expenses, and then subtract the amortization of the research asset. So some final thoughts on performance measurement. So always a good idea to look at the past before you start going into the future. So try to understand, hey, how does my return on invested capital compare to competitors? What are trends over time? And that will give you a better sense of, hey, where exactly does the value come from? And will also ground your forecast that you make, will ground it in reality so that you know, hey, is this, let's say, 20% return on invested capital that I assume right now, is that realistic based off what I've seen in the past? Of course, look back as far as possible. So long horizons will give you a better idea of trends that are going on. Of course, put a little bit more emphasis on more recent data, but taking a longer view will enable you to kind of pick out one-time events or pick out long-term trends that will help you with your analysis of the company. So key takeaways for today. So if you were going to compare on performance, compare on return on invested capital, because return on invested capital rather than ROA is not affected by non-operating assets, and it's not affected by leverage like return on equity is. If you're going to compare on revenue growth, make sure that you're actually comparing organic growth with organic growth. So watch out for inorganic growth, merger and acquisitions. Look out for exchange rate effects. Look out for one-time events and changes in accounting standards that can also affect what's going on. And then finally, check your credit health. So for the short term, look at the interest coverage ratio, look at ratings. And for long term, look at leverage of companies to see if they are able to meet their financial obligations. And then in the final part of the lecture, I gave you some clues into how to adjust for R&D, how to adjust for operating leases. Hopefully useful. I'll see you guys next week.